Hello Fearless Gamers, Matt here for Fearless Games, and welcome to How to Play Battlefield Gothic Remastered Part 3. Before we start this video, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. That way you know when more of these videos come out. Hit that little bell icon so YouTube actually tells you when these videos come out. And give this video a like. That way it gets out there and circulates more. And I can also see what content you guys really want to see. This helps me out greatly with deciding what kind of video content to give to you guys. And like I said, it helps out the channel a lot. And we really appreciate it if you could do that. So, with that out of the way, let's continue with the video. Today we'll be looking at the shooting phase. This is the phase where you get to unleash the fury of your vessels upon your enemy, blasting them away with your lance batteries, your weapon batteries, your Nova cannons, peeling away their armor and slowly breaking them down until they're nothing but dust and debris scattered along the stars. This is quite a meaty video, so let's dive right in with the shooting phase. So the first thing we need to talk about is range, firing arcs, and target priority. First one is the very simple one, which is range. All weaponry has a range in which it can fire at other vessels. The way you determine this is by taking your tape measure, placing it next to the stem of your vessel, and measuring out to the stem of another vessel. So, if your weapons have a 30 centimeter range, then they can shoot at anything that's from 0 to 30 centimeters out. If it's got a range of 45, it can shoot out to 45 centimeters, and so on and so forth. In the cases of weaponry that have a bracket range, like 30 centimeters to 120 centimeters, they can only shoot at things that are no closer than 30 centimeters from the vessel, and no further out than 120. Anything with under 30 centimeters can't be targeted. And this is all checked out by the data sheets of your vessel. So, like in this example, a Gothic cruiser wishes to fire at this Chaos vessel. Its lance weapons have a range of 30 centimeters, so it just has to measure stem to stem, and if that vessel's within 30, it's allowed to fire at it. The next thing we'll be talking about is firing arcs. We discussed this a little bit in part 1 of this series. This is where you see what facing the target vessels are to your ship to determine which weapons have firing range to it. You do this by taking your bearing compass and placing it over the model, where the center of the bearing compass is right over the center of the base. And that black line on the bearing compass is running along the spine of the model. And then you use those lines on the bearing compass to determine which firing arc your target is in. You've got your port side, your starboard side, your front, and your stern. Now, so in this example, the Gothic sees that the cruiser's in its front arc, so it can only fire at it with weapons that can shoot out of the front arc. Now, you might have a weapon system that can fire in multiple arcs. In these cases, they can basically pick whichever target they want to shoot at as long as they're within one of their appropriate arcs. However, just for clarification, that isn't it gets to fire once in each arc. It gets to fire at, and it chooses which arc it's going to fire out of, and that's the arc it fires out of this turn. So it could fire out of the front in this turn, but then the port in the next turn, and the starboard in the next turn. But it's not a case of it gets to fire once out of one arc, once out of the other two arcs. It only gets one shot. Now, in cases of ships that land on the line of a firing arc, the attacking player gets to choose which arc that vessel is in. And it cannot change this once they determine that. And then the last thing we need to go over is target priority. In 40K, the closest vessel poses the greatest danger, so that vessel is going to always have target priority to your ship. But you are allowed to target any vessel you want that are in range and in the right firing arc. But if they're not the closest, you're going to have to roll a leadership check to ignore that closer vessel. If this leadership is passed, you can fire at a vessel that's further away. But if it fails, you have to fire at the closest target, regardless of what it is or how much you really want to get rid of it. So like in this example, our Gothic has 2 Chaos Cruisers in its firing arc. It wants to shoot at the one that's 30 centimeters away, but there's one that's 15 centimeters away. So in order to do so, it must make a leadership check. If it succeeds, then he can ignore the ship that's 15 centimeters away and shoot at the vessel behind it. But what in the case of multiple targets in different arcs? Target priority is an arc-to-arc basis. So any unengaged weaponry can fire at any target that's within its firing arc as long as they follow target priority rules. But this doesn't mean a vessel that's closer but in a different firing arc prevents you from firing at a ship in a different arc. In this example right here, we got a Gothic cruiser that has 2 Chaos targets it can shoot at. One that's 15 centimeters on its left and one that's 30 centimeters on its right. It has 2 weapon profiles, one that has a firing arc out of the left and one that has a firing arc out of the right. The firing weapons on the right side can shoot at the 30 centimeter target on its right without needing to roll a command check because those right weaponries can only fire out of its right facing arc. So even though there's a ship closer on its left face, it can ignore it because it's not in its proper firing arc. However, the weapons on the left do need to roll a command check if it wishes to ignore that vessel because it is that close. So if there's a vessel behind it, it would need to roll a leadership check. Direct fire lances are high-powered energy weapons. These things are capable of melting through armor plating and cutting small vessels in half with ease. These weaponry is probably, in my opinion, one of the more deadly weapons in the game. And the way that they work is, for every point of strength they have, that's 1d6 you get to roll. And for every roll of a 4, 5, or 6 that you get, that equals a hit, regardless of the vessel's armor. That's just how powerful these weapon systems are. And in cases where a lance system has multiple shots, you are allowed to do what's called split firing, as long as you take into account target priority. We'll get into split firing a little bit later. But here's an example of how a lance attack would work. We've got a Gothic class cruiser going to fire at a Chaos vessel that's on its left side. It's got a port side lance battery of 4. That means it's allowed to fire 4 shots out of its left side. It doesn't have any other vessels that it wants to target, so it's going to take 4d6 and roll them. For every roll of a 4 or better, it counts as 1 hit along that vessel. Weapon batteries are the second most common weapons in Battlefleet Gothic. These, instead of using large, high-powered weapon laser cannons, are using multiple smaller caliber cannons that usually are lining along the sides of a vessel, taking in more quantity over quality. They can be like small shells or tiny energy blasts. Doesn't matter what the fluff behind it is, they all use the same rules. And those go as following. When firing your weapon batteries, you first must determine what class of vessel you're attacking, and they go as follows. Battleships and cruisers count as capital ships. Escort squadrons count as escorts. Defense are defenses, and ordnance are ordnance. Once you determine the type, you then have to determine which facing it's presenting to you. This is done by taking the bearing compass, placing it over your target, and seeing which facing is facing the direction the attack is coming from. If its sides are presented to your weapons, it's a beam. If its front is presented to your weapons, it's closing, and if its rear is facing your weapons, it's moving away. In the case of weapons that always count as closing, against defenses, they still use the defense column. They don't get a special exception to that. Once you determined the type of ship and the facing it's presented to you, you then collect your dice pool. You would look at the weapon battery stat on your ship's data sheet, and each point of strength is a d6 you get to roll. Now, in cases of squadrons, they all get to fire their weapon batteries together, so they would pool their weapon pool together. So if you have an escort squadron of 4 vessels, you would take all their weapon battery profiles and combine them together to make your dice pool. So same deal with cruisers. If you have cruisers in a squadron, you would total both of their dice pool up, and that would be your dice pool for the attack. In cases of having multiple weapons that function off the gunnery table, they count as firing simultaneously, but the controlling player gets to determine the order in which they are fired. But they count as firing simultaneously for purposes of blast markers. So, like for example, Space Marines, they have a weapon called a bombardment cannon. It functions as a weapon battery with some slight differences, which we'll go over in another video. So because of this, you would roll their dice pool separately, but because it's the same vessel firing at the same target as its regular weapon batteries, they count as firing simultaneously, so the bombardment cannon doesn't suffer any negatives that may be negative modifiers that may be produced by the first wave of weapon batteries if you decided to have the weapon batteries go first, which in most cases you probably are going to want to because of how bombardment cannons work. So it's not a case of the weapon batteries go, then the bombardment cannon goes, and the bombardment cannon suffers a negative to blast markers because it technically fired at the same time. That's going to make sense in just a minute here. So, now that you've got your dice pool, you would then consult the gunnery table. You would find the total dice pool that you have here on the side, and then you'd find the class of vessel and its facing on the top here. Draw one line going down and across, and where they meet is your total dice value for the attack. Now you'll see here that this dice chart only goes up to 20, so what if you happen to have, like say 2 cruisers that have so many weapon batteries you go above 20? You would break it down into a smaller dice pool. So for example, if you have a dice pool of 32, you would check the results for 20, and then you'd check the results for 12, and then combine those 2 results together to get your final result. Once you have that number, you then have to apply modifiers to it. And there are 3 modifiers that apply to a gunnery table result. The first is range. If the ship is 15 centimeters or closer, you do a column shift to the left. This is because it's easier to hit a vessel that's much closer to you because there's less distance and less spray from the shots. If the vessel is greater than 30 centimeters away, then you do a column shift to the right because it's a lot harder to hit those vessels. The shells may go astray and go completely past them, so you get less chances of hitting. And if the target is behind any blast markers, that's a column shift to the right. So like I mentioned before, so if you had like a weapon, if one ship had a bombardment cannon and a weapon batteries, and you decided it was going to go weapon batteries then bombardment cannon, because they fired simultaneously, that blast marker modifier wouldn't apply to the bombardment cannon because it was from the same ship firing all of its weapon batteries at the same time. But the next ship would have to apply that modifier. And we'll talk about blast markers in another video. So, after you've applied all of those modifiers to your result, the final result is how many dice you get to roll against a vessel. And then you roll once you have your final dice pool, you roll your d6s and you check the results against the ship's armor. Unlike lance batteries, the roll you're trying to get is equal to or greater than the target's armor. So if the ship has an armor value of 5, your weapon batteries need a 5 or greater to score a hit. So now let's take a look at this as an example. We have a Tyrant class cruiser that's going to be shooting its port side weapon batteries at this Chaos vessel. First, we measure out to see how far away the vessel is, and we can see that it is 32 centimeters away, which is within range of our weapon batteries. We use the bearing compass to determine which facing is presented towards those weapon batteries, which we see is its side, which means it's a beam. We look at the gunnery table, and we have our weapon battery value is 6, and we look to find the capital ship's beam on the top. We draw a line going from the 6 all the way to the right, and a line down from capital ships, and we come to a result of 2. So it gets to roll 2d6. However, we see that it is 32 centimeters away, which means we have a column shift to the right, giving us a final result of 1. If the vessel was within 30 centimeters, it would be a dice result of 2. And if it was with 15 or closer, it would be a dice result of 3. So, once we determined our dice pool, we then roll the dice and attack against the cruiser's armor value. The Chaos Cruiser has an armor value of 5, so any 5s or higher count as a hit. As I've mentioned earlier in this video, there is a rule about splitting fire. A ship may elect to split its weapon fire amongst multiple targets, provided that it's halved its weapons for any effects that the ship may be under, such as special orders, or being crippled, or other forms of damage. It cannot split its weapon batteries or lance fire of any type at one single vessel. So you can't just go, I'm going to fire one lance shot. Okay, then I'm going to fire another lance shot. It's either you fire both of them or you don't. You got to declare that there. You can't just split it to see what happens. Now, if it has multiple weapons in the same arc, it can elect to shoot them at different vessels, but target priority still applies. So if you want to fire your lance batteries at the really close vessel, but shoot the weapon batteries at a vessel behind it, you would need to make a leadership check, and if you fail, then both weapon systems have to fire at the closer vessel. The Nova Cannon is an extremely powerful weapon that must be mounted to the front of any vessel. This is because it needs the force of the engines to compensate for the recoil. It fires its projectile at high velocity, which is set to detonate after it travels a certain distance. Once it reaches that distance, it implodes and creates this huge, massive explosion that is devastating to all that are caught within it. So the rules for a Nova Cannon are as follows. First, it's a template weapon, so you're going to need a template. The easiest one to do is if you have yourself a bearing compass, it's actually the back of the bearing compass. If you don't have access to these, I have a link in the description for a Google Drive that has the old free download templates that GW allowed you to print off their site. So you can print one, cut it out, and you have a template. If you don't feel like printing the templates and cutting them out yourselves, if you have the old GW green blast templates, they actually do have markings you can use on the small blast marker. Unfortunately, I couldn't find mine. It has a little small circle on the inside that's the exact diameter of the blast template that they're talking about. And you don't count the outer edge, you just count the inside edge there. If you have the big guy like this, it also has a circle engraved on the middle, and that is the exact size of the blast mark template, so you can use that as well. If you want to make your own, the dimensions are supposed to be 5 centimeters edge to edge here, with the inner hole's diameter being 1.2 centimeters. So to fire your Nova Cannon, you would first take your template and place it where its edges are within 30 and no further out than 150 centimeters. You get to place it anywhere within the firing arc of the vessel. When placing it, you don't have to place it directly over a vessel. You can place it where it's touching multiple vessels, so you don't have to center it dead smack on one ship. Once the template is placed, you measure. If it's within 45 centimeters, you would roll a scatter die and a single d6. If it's between 45 and 60 centimeters, you'd roll 2d6. If it's beyond 60 centimeters, you roll 3d6. You would roll these die, add them all together, and that's how many centimeters it needs to move in the direction the scatter die arrow rolled. In the cases of rolling a direct hit, you don't move it at all. And one note about this that I need to say is If you plan to brace for impact, you must declare this before the scatter die is rolled. Once the scatter die is rolled, you cannot brace for impact against a Nova Cannon. A target whose base ends up being in contact with the blast template suffers an automatic hit, regardless of armor value. Any ship whose blast template comes in contact with the center hole of the template suffers a D6 number of damage, regardless of armor value. Any ordnance that are touched by the template automatically are destroyed. If the template ends up hitting nothing, you place a blast marker where it landed. An important note on Nova Cannons is they are a line of sight based weapon, so any kind of celestial phenomena, asteroid fields, planets or anything like that affects line of sight affects the Nova Cannon. You can still shoot at the celestial phenomena if you want to, and on a direct hit you would roll a d6 and place a number of blast markers around the edge of whatever celestial phenomena that you ended up hitting. And in the case of Eldar holofields and Nova Cannons, the holofields and similar defenses affect the initial hit of the Nova Cannon. So when they make contact, they roll a d6, and if they succeed, they nullify the effects of the Nova Cannon, and a blast template and blast markers placed in its stead facing the direction that the ship that fired it was from. But if they fail their roll, then they get hit by the Nova Cannon as normal. They don't get to, so in the cases of if they get the center of the template over them and they fail their initial holofield save, they can't roll for each hit that the d6 rolls. They suffer those hits no matter what. Some weapons, such as the Necron's Nightmare Field and Star Pulse Generator, which are area effect weapons that do not aim nor direct at a particular target, such weapons are not blocked by line of sight obstacles, such as hulks, minefields, or celestial phenomena, nor can they be saved against Eldar holofields. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. Chaos marks, which affect nearby ships based on area, or celestial events such as warp drive implosions or other celestial phenomena, are not affected by line of sight obstructing obstacles. And one final note is exterminatus weapons that certain missions require you to equip onto a vessel cannot be equipped to a vessel that does not natively have a prow weapon, because it must replace a prow weapon. So if there's no prow weapon profile on the vessel, that vessel cannot be equipped with an exterminatus weapon. And that is going to be it for this video. There is still more to talk about in the shooting phase, but there is so much to go over, and because of just how bad my internet is right now, I can't make this video much longer, so we're going to cut this down and send it out and break it up into 2 parts. So when we get back, we're going to talk about damage, catastrophic effects, and blast markers and shields. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments. I'll try to answer them. Like I said in a previous video, I'll gather up all the most common questions and make a special FAQ video to go over all those once we're done with this series. So thank you all for watching, and until next time, fearless gamers, take care.